and let us all do we can to build a better future. This next story is going to be difficult to talk about. We are witnessing firsthand a reporter who lost his family by an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. A journalist found out while on air, just hours after, it was reported that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had pressured Qatar over the network's critical coverage. So Al Jazeera has been pressured by the U.S. government, this U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, to maybe halt their criticism of Israel. And unfortunately, this situation took place. And I want to play this video here. We are witnessing a man who has lost everything. I only can imagine what it's like to hear this news. Al Jazeera's brave veteran journalist, Wael Dahoud's wife, son, and daughter were killed in an Israeli airstrike, which targeted a shelter house they had fled to. He received this while on air, covering the nonstop strikes by Israel.
جوالك يا حسن بينفعش
So the chief of Al Jazeera's Gaza bureau, Wael Dahoud, learned while reporting on air Wednesday that his wife, son, and daughter and grandson have been killed in an Israeli airstrike like the ones the veteran journalist has been covering for nearly 3 weeks. This is him quoted on air. What happened? They don't know where they are, he asked, before being told his daughter had been hospitalized. His colleagues later broke the news to viewers that his family members had been killed. The channel aired footage of the bureau chief weeping over his son. I will not be showing that image, who appeared to be laying on the floor of a nearby hospital. Medical providers have been warning for days that hospitals are overrun with victims of airstrikes and medical supplies and fuel and running dangerously low, putting the healthcare system in Gaza at risk of collapse. But hey, according to James Wood, they're all bad guys. Biden doesn't believe the numbers. But yet the Biden-Harris administration is saying, hey, maybe put a humanitarian pause, not a ceasefire, but a humanitarian pause. A humanitarian pause. This is a devastating, horrific action by Israel. But yet it's important to note that our own politicians are overrun with hypocrisy. They're hypocrites through and through. And I find their actions to be disgusting. I find their theatrics to be boring. And they fail at every point in time to really show their humanity. I want to pull up this video here. This is acting 101.
This is war. It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly, and it's going to be messy. And innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different. I wish that wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen. And that doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it dismissible. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to still express concerns about that and do everything we can to help the Israelis do everything they can to minimize it. But that's unfortunately the nature of conflict.
Now, that was in regards to the war between Israel and Palestine. Now, I want to put that in comparison to the war between Ukraine and Russia. Here's the same person's response. Let's go ahead and play it up here. Gotta love it, right?
It's hard to look at what he's doing in Ukraine, what his forces are doing in Ukraine, and think that any ethical moral individual could justify that. It's difficult to look at the
He's trying to cry. This is a creature that's trying to act human. He's not human. These politicians are not human. Even if they work for an administration or a staffer, anyone in DC is not a human. Where's that same humanity for the children? Okay. Humanity, compassion.
it's difficult to look at the it's difficult to look at some of the images and imagine that any well-thinking, serious, mature leader would do that.
Sort of like how Biden is indifferent towards his own citizens. Yeah, I know. I'm going to go there. Like the people of Maui, people of East Palestine, Ohio, Flint, Michigan, all of America at this point. All the while ignoring the death toll that's taking place in Gaza. But yet his administration is saying, hey, humanitarian pause. Not a ceasefire, but a humanitarian pause.
So I can't talk to his psychology, but I think we can all speak to his depravity. It's hard to...
So after sitting through all of this, I think it's important to get another perspective. Now, as it stands right now, the total is potentially maybe 3,000 children have lost their lives. I do want to pull up this video here and share it with all of you. At least bring in a fresh perspective.
The death toll in Gaza continues to soar. The Gaza Health Ministry now says that the healthcare system in Gaza is completely out of service. And this all comes as you have thousands of people being killed and tens of thousands more injured who are now likely to die because they're not getting access to the healthcare that they need, all while they are being cut off from the most basic resources that they desperately need access to. And what is the United States doing in all of this? They are refusing a ceasefire. We're hearing the Biden administration now double down in saying that there should not be a ceasefire, that Israel should not pull back from its ongoing bombardment of Gaza, which has gotten even worse over the last few days, if you can even imagine that. And now the Biden administration is saying that they do not support a ceasefire because it would just help Hamas.
What we would believe that a ceasefire right now is only going to benefit Hamas.
Well, my question to them is, what is Israel doing to hurt Hamas right now? Seriously, because if you look at the overwhelming majority of the casualties in the Gaza Strip, they are civilians. Nearly half of those casualties are children. There's also a large number of women being killed, and yet not nearly as many Hamas militants as Israel claims that they are targeting and attacking, yet they just seem to be bombing the civilians. And yet what makes it even more sickening is that what the United States is doing is they are rushing advisors. The Pentagon is sending military generals to Israel to try to talk them down. Why are they doing that? Well, it's not because they care about the civilians in Gaza, because clearly they have shown that they don't. It's because they know that if Israel goes forward with a ground offensive, then their troops are going to get slaughtered. And it is going to be a very, very bad look for the United States, for Israel, for the West, you name it. So the US is warning Israel to rethink what it's doing, not because it wants to save civilians in the Gaza Strip or because it's looking out for their lives whatsoever. No, it's because the US is looking out for its own image. Because as it stands, when it comes to the way that things are going in Ukraine right now, they are not going well. The United States is in a situation where it is not winning. It is not seeing any kind of military successes. In fact, as we're seeing, Russia is gaining even more ground. And so it's almost as if the US is going to its other ally and saying, look, we cannot afford another defeat at this point. We can't be in a situation where you do something that results in thousands of your men dying, because the United States is not in a position to continue to supply them with more weapons and more ammo as they are wanting. And yet,
now hold on, to be very clear here, We all know that Congress is definitely going to pass any kind of bill necessary for Israel and Ukraine, because let's face it, as I played on yesterday's show, the bloody call from Raytheon is abundantly on point, where it says, like, hey, look, there's a lot to be made for money. There's a lot of money to be made for this war. Apologies for that stutter. There's money to be made from war. It's a great time to be with Raytheon, because they're making a lot of money. And again, this report, I want to give a shout out to her. She's a journalist, Rachel Blevins. So please be sure to follow her on social media. She's doing phenomenal work. So let's continue on with the rest of the video.
Yes, that continues to be the case, even as Biden gave that lovely Oval Office speech last week.
Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy.
He is calling on Congress to approve $105 billion. For what? For more war, for Ukraine, for Israel, for Taiwan, so that the U.S. can continue to carry out all of these different conflicts, so that it can continue what appears to be this race to World War III that we're currently on here. And it's yet another reminder that the US isn't just opposing a ceasefire in Gaza. No, it also opposed a ceasefire in Ukraine. In fact, it has opposed any form of peace talks in Ukraine that could have led to civilian lives being saved. Instead, the US has insisted that Ukraine needs to stay at war. And now it is doing the exact same thing with Israel, just not in the way that you may think, because just because the US doesn't support a ground invasion, or maybe it is encouraging Israel to hold off on a ground invasion, I should say, for now, that doesn't mean that the US is suddenly promoting peace in the region, because they're certainly not doing that. But what's worse about the Biden administration's response to all of this, specifically as it relates to Israel's bombardment in Gaza, is that National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby literally sat there and he said the civilians are going to continue to die.
This is war. It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly, and it's going to be messy. And innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different. I wish that wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen.
That was his response, was to say, well, this is a war. Civilians sometimes die in war. And so we should expect more civilian casualties. What a response when you are talking about one of the most densely populated areas on Earth being bombed into oblivion right now. You're talking about all of these civilians. It's not as if they were just quote unquote collateral damage in an airstrike, as the United States likes to call it. No, they are being specifically targeted. Their homes are being targeted. They are being targeted when they are following Israeli orders to move to the other side of Gaza. They are being targeted when they do literally anything. War crimes are being committed left and right when it comes to collective punishment, when it comes to the forced displacement of people. And yet, for Kirby to just sit there and say, oh, well, this is a war and sometimes civilians die, it's like, how tone deaf do you have to be to try to apply, I don't even want to call it logic, but to try to apply that level of thinking, that claim, in a situation like this? Because it just does not work. And it also is so completely insensitive to all of the civilians on the ground. And it also does not make the United States look good on the world stage.
Case in point, let's look at all the protests that are taking place and all the numerous individuals, especially, look, not a huge fan of his show, but Piers Morgan had, some outstanding guests defending Gaza. I'm not going to include Cenk, because while Cenk had his little rant, I wasn't a really huge fan of building a big old wall and special forces going in there. Cenk, I know things are bad for your book, but look, you're not contributing to the conversation. But for the most part, we're seeing people on social media calling out at the fact that all these strikes, we're witnessing an extermination. We're witnessing a destruction of a people. And already this is going to cost Biden, because his administration is gambling on the fact that war is going to get him reelected, or he's let the perception of being a war leader is going to help him get reelected. Already, Biden is losing votes amongst black voters. He's already, if not already, lost votes amongst Arab and Muslim voters. He's losing votes with the Latino community. He's losing votes in general. So this administration is effectively ending itself in real time. So perception drives reality. And let's look at the real truth. This administration is allowing conflicts to explode all over the world. Biden is not being an effective leader. All the people within his administration, be it staffers or people in key positions of power, including the vice president, have done nothing to ease the situation at hand. And Americans, I think we can all universally agree, no matter where you stand politically, no matter what generation you're part of, I think we all can agree. We don't want World War III to happen, because once those nukes drop, once the dust has been settled, there will be no reconstruction. The survivors will envy the dead. And I dread to see what humanity will look like in the aftermath, okay? That's if we do survive. That's if there's any pockets of humanity left. We will not be who we are now. We will never get to this point in time of technology ever again.
You know, speaking of how the U.S. doesn't want Israel to go forward with the ground offensive right now because they're worried about how it's going to make them look when they see a bunch of Israeli troops get slaughtered going into Gaza. Well, the U.S. certainly isn't doing itself any favors by coming out to the international community, repeatedly vetoing any attempts at ceasefires that are being proposed in the United Nations Security Council. And then on top of that, just kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, oh, well, you know, civilians die. That's just what happens. Meanwhile, the Pentagon is also reporting that there have been 14 attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria in the last week alone. Now, I think it's notable that they are publicizing this because they are specifically claiming that these attacks have quote unquote Iranian fingerprints all over them. And first of all, we should be having the conversation about why the U.S. has troops in Iraq and Syria still to begin with, because of course in Iraq they are propping up the...
Now, never forget the reason why we're there. We can thank former President Donald Trump for telling us the truth. That's right, I have to bring up this old gem of a story. When interviewed about why U.S. forces are in Syria, he didn't say what Ronnie Boy Reagan would have said, or Bush Sr., or Bill Clinton, or Bush Jr., with Cheney, with his hands on the puppet strings, or even Barack Obama or Biden. No, see, normally those politicians, the ones that I named, would say, oh, we're there for freedom. We're there for understanding. We're there. We are there. We are there to restore a nation and make sure that democracy shines brightly. No, Trump said the truth. He said we're there for the oil. That's the only reason why we're there in the Middle East. We're there for the resources. We're there for the oil. 1, 2, 3. Simple. Problem solved. That's why we're there.
U.S.-backed government there so that we don't see another version of Afghanistan where that government very quickly falls if the U.S. military were to pull out of the country, which wouldn't necessarily be the same case, but it would eventually be close enough. And then in Syria, you have a situation where U.S. troops are illegally occupying a portion of the country. As a reminder, the U.S. has tried incredibly hard to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad there, but they were not successful. And now you still have this ongoing illegal occupation. So it's interesting whenever you hear the Pentagon come out and complain and say, oh, hey, our troops are being targeted. It's like, yeah, your troops are there illegally. But the fact that they are publicizing it, they're doing so for a reason. And they're specifically doing so that they can talk about these Iranian fingerprints, which I think it's interesting that they are bringing that up and sort of bringing that into the conversation, because there continues to be this concern that we are going to see some sort of a confrontation between the U.S. and Iran, which is to say that the U.S. is obviously supporting Israel with their unwavering support. And then the concern is that we could see a direct war with Iran, which, by the way, that is exactly what Netanyahu wants. He has been dreaming about that for a very, very long time. Speaking of Netanyahu, no one wants to see war right now more than that man, because it takes away from all of his troubles that he was running into before all of this broke.
I'm glad she's going to bring this up here in this video, because what the media is failing to do, or I've seen some stories here and there from corporate media, to be fair, is that Netanyahu had a lot of domestic issues. He had a lot of problems with his own government collapsing in on itself, lack of confidence in Prime Minister Netanyahu. That's what he's been dealing with. And again, just have to ask that question mark, all those huge walls, those watchtowers, barbed wire fence, drones, cameras, IDF forces. How did intel services, intelligence agencies, how did they not see this coming? What, again, the question was there an order just to, hey, take it easy for a minute, guys? Ain't nothing going to happen, or was it done on purpose? Who knows? It's just a little suspicious. It's just a little suspicious, but I could be wrong.
Out, and it's interesting to see at least the protest movements happening around the world. I know that that's something I've been touching on, because I think it's really important to see the response from people, especially now as you see just how high the death toll has gotten in Gaza, how devastating the consequences are for civilians. It's like Israel is putting itself in this situation. It is doing this to itself, and it is now in a position where it is turning the rest of the world against it. And the United States is right there with Israel, so they are doing the exact same thing, because they are being seen as the party that is pro-war and constantly wants more and more war. And that is especially notable as you have Israel repeating a lot of the language that the United States used in the aftermath of 9/11. And that goes from literally calling the attack on October 7th that was carried out by Hamas Israel's 9/11, to then Netanyahu invoking George W. Bush's axis of evil in a recent speech that he gave, which of course Bush used that term back in early 2002. And then you also have Israel now claiming that Hamas was carrying documents with directions on how to make chemical weapons in their pockets. And it's so interesting to see this case where Israel is constantly trying to use the same rhetoric that the US used in the aftermath of 9/11, because they know that it works then, and that the world, to a certain extent, got on board with this so-called war on terrorism and allowed the US to do what it wanted. You're also seeing a version of that as you see French President Macron go to Israel and now call for Hamas to be added to this international coalition of fighting ISIS. That is notable too, because that's one of the things Netanyahu has tried to do, is to claim that Hamas equals ISIS, basically to say, this is the bad guy group of the moment. This is who we, meaning collectively the world, need to be targeting. And yet what he's not doing is he's not admitting that when it comes to Hamas and the Palestinian people as a whole, they are living in an occupied territory. They are living in a place where Israel controls everything that they do on its end when it comes to access to resources. He's also not admitting the fact that Hamas is what it is today thanks to Israel and thanks to the support that it gave them decades ago as it wanted to undermine the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Gaza, because Israel did not want a legitimate Palestinian state to go up against. They did not want to have to recognize it, and now they haven't recognized it, and instead they just point at Hamas and they say, well, look at the bad guys, and that's exactly what they are continuing to do now. And so then you have Macron come along with this just brilliant idea to say, hey, we've got this coalition that fights ISIS, why don't we add Hamas to that? And
This is the same President Emmanuel Macron that's also cracked down on his own people and has in the past used police forces to silence any kind of activist movement or any kind of unions or workers who were rightfully striking against his government that was wrongly implementing more neoliberal policies. So You have the French president being indifferent. You have the U.S. president being senile and indifferent. All the while, the whole world is watching as a extermination is taking place. And reporters losing their families. Reporters dying. People dying. This is absolute madness and insanity. How this is happening, why this is happening, it's all because it's part of one big plan. And so long as we are silent to it, so long as we are subservient to it, nothing's going to change. We all know that this is wrong.
And that's a way to justify the U.S. continuing its support for Israel in this ongoing war that Israel has launched in Gaza. The only problem there is that Israel's war on Hamas isn't actually a war on Hamas. It is a war on the Palestinian people. It's a war on the Palestinian children who are being massacred right now. That is what it is turning out to be. It is a war on the people of the Gaza Strip, a piece of land that Israel wants to control. And that's why it is continuing to target it. And the people there know that. The world knows that. Everyone sees that. And yet, the thing is, who will admit that? But I think it's incredibly important to note here these attempts to at least have some kind of a humanitarian ceasefire, to point to the countries that are pushing for that to happen, and also to point to the countries who are against that. Because again, the United States is in a position where it is going from standing for at least so-called freedom and democracy to now pushing the rest of the world to be against it, because the US is so incredibly in favor of war that it can't see past that. And at the end of the day, in a situation like this, where you are seeing such dire circumstances in Gaza, that you are looking at the death toll already, with thousands of people likely to expand to tens of thousands of people, and yet the US is still standing there and saying no ceasefire, we demand more war, then that's something everyone should be talking about.
Well said. Well said indeed. And if you're not following her on social media, her name is Rachel Blevins. I think she did a great breakdown of that video. Please do so. She's done phenomenal work. She's a journalist. She's done so much more, especially for independent media. So please do that right away. So what can we take away from this? First of all, the earlier story and footage of that reporter losing and finding out his family passed away in real time on air is by far the most horrific thing anyone can go through. And unfortunately, the administration will still not call for a ceasefire, just for a humanitarian pause. A pause. A humanitarian pause. A pause on humanity. We could be better. We should be better. Maybe someday. Just not today, until people say enough.